Hello, class. Welcome to this session for synthesis. So let's get into it. Let me share my screen. So you guys should be working, of course, on finding your sources for your research paper, your main assignment that you'll have for project 3. Of course, before that, you're going to be looking just for sources to just do a literature review with a proposal. Part of one of the things that I want you to work on while doing this is finding connections between all your sources to make up your argument. So right now, of course, you don't know what your argument is. You don't know, what exactly is happening with your topic. That's what you're trying to figure out. That's what the lit review and the proposal is all about. Eventually, though, once that's done, you want to make an argument. And synthesizing your sources is the best way of doing that. Let me, I'm not going to do fallacies in this PowerPoint. I forgot to delete that. We're just doing synthesis now. All right. So what is synthesis? Basically, it's finding a discussion between all of your sources, finding out what connections they have to make, and being able to come up with something new based on those connections. You basically are showing the relationship between what source A has to say with source B. And then what can you infer from that relationship? What does this mean? And this is the point that you bring in. This is what you bring into your paper. That is the very basis of synthesis. And it's important to know and understand your sources to be able to do synthesis correctly. This is why we're taking 2 weeks to just look for sources before we even, our second major project is due, because we're looking for sources, highlighting them, reading them as much as possible, and then that way we can, what based on what we highlight and what we see, we're able to make connections. And this is important because once we make these connections, it makes it so much easier to write your actual paper, however long it's going to be. So this is basically the formula. You have source A, you have source B, and then based on those two sources, what you've read, what you've seen, you come up with a conclusion, which is C here. Very simple, but it's the gist of it. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that just it's just two sources. It might be source A, B, C to come up with D or further, right? But at the very basis of it, this is synthesis. Um, of course, like I mentioned though, before you can even draw out any kind of conclusion, you need to be able to summarize your sources. This is part of why we are doing the annotated bibliography along with the proposal in your literature review. I want you to understand your major sources that you're using in your paper. As such, you need to be able to understand what that paper has to say. And that's why we're taking so much time to just look at your journal articles and whatever other sources you have. Of course, you can have YouTube videos and online articles as long as, of course, you can explain their credibility. But once you understand all that, you understand where they're coming from, what they have to say, what points they argue, you can start to then draw relationships between those sources, try to make a connecting dot, basically. Um, having said all that, you can't use all of one paper, all the sources of one paper to be able to make that connection. But that I mean, like, if by now you should have seen some journal articles, you might have some journal articles already. You know that they're heavy, they have a lot of information. As such, you're not going to bring all of that information to your paper. You're going to be selective. You're going to bring the information that's important to what you're trying to say. Of course, make sure you get the whole argument. Don't just get bits and pieces that support your argument. But the idea being that you're going to find the stuff that's relevant to your point, select that information, and then use that instead of using the whole article, right? You might be able to do that for something smaller like a YouTube video, but like for a journal article, not so much. It's your responsibility as the writer to select the ideas that are the most important so that you can include them into your paper for your reader to understand easily, right? And this, I have an example here. Is the information in source B, whatever that source is, an intended illustration of generalizations in source A? Would it be useful to compare and contrast source C with source B? Having read and considered sources A, B, and C, can you infer something else? D, not a source, but your own idea. It sounds complicated, but it's not really. Think of it this way. Imagine I'm going to use my old classic example I use all the time, plastic bottles. And I am researching one-use plastic bottles for my paper. And I find a source that talks about how plastic bottles are made and how long they take to deteriorate. It's not necessarily making an argument, it's just an information about single-use plastics, right? I find another source which explains how many plastic bottles end up in the oceans, right? and it's saying that most of the pollution is from plastic bottles. I don't know if that's true. I'm just giving an example. And that's source B, right? And then I have source C that argues that we need to get rid of single-use plastics, and they list a bunch of different reasons. So you can see based on those examples that all three are about plastic bottles, right? Single-use plastics. But one is about just informing you about plastics. One is telling you how many end up in the plastics, and one is arguing for plastics, like getting rid of them. So based on that, what can I infer? What kind of connections can I make between these three sources that I can then bring up to my paper? And maybe at the end of the day, like based on source A, which talks about how long plastic bottles need to deteriorate, it's really harmful that they end up in the ocean because it takes um, I forget how long, but like hundreds of years for plastic, whatever the case, it's a long time, right? And source B mentions this that that's why we need to keep plastic bottles out of the oceans, at least maybe not get rid of all single-use plastics. But then source C talks about getting rid of single-use plastics specifically because they do end up in the ocean, something that source B talks about. Do you see what I'm getting at here? That's what you were inferring. And then I can then make up the claim that because of this, because of these sources, I am arguing that we got to get rid of single-use plastics. And that's what synthesis is all about. It's all about finding the connections between all of your sources and then making an argument based on that or making an inference, right? So you might use the sources multiple time in your paper. So say you have, and honestly, this is something you should really strive for if your journal articles especially, you don't want to just use them once in your paper and call it good, especially if it's a very good journal article that's, say, for instance, like I was arguing against, not synthesis, arguing against plastic bottles, and that source C that I had that's arguing and giving me a bunch of great information about plastic bottles, single-use plastic bottles are really bad for the environment. I'm probably going to want to use that paper throughout my my paper, my assignment three because it has so many good points that I want to bring up. One single paragraph just using it isn't enough. And you want to kind of try to use this for all of your sources if possible. Sure, you might have a source or two that you just use once and call it good, like maybe the YouTube video or article, but it's your journal articles especially, you want to weave those throughout your paper as much as possible. Keep referring back to them. You only have to set up their credibility once. Once that's done, you're able to use them throughout without having to really mention who these people are and why they're credible. You just cite them, right? And we'll have practice in this when we get further on here in this presentation. So using your sources effectively is what's important when it comes to this. Uh, as always, your purpose in writing will determine how you relate your sources. So if someone wants a report over an argument, it might be a little different. That's kind of what you're doing now, especially for your project too. It's a report, right? You're just reporting what's happening in the conversation. Your argument isn't really going to go become something until your third assignment, which we'll work on after the second project. Still, this second project is all in service to the third project. It's all about collecting information, finding what's going on with your subject, and then eventually you'll figure out, well, what do I want to say about it? Um, let's see. So standards of a synthesis essay. So something to keep in mind when it comes to research papers, they're going to want to start seeing this you being able to connect your sources together to be able to make your own argument about them. So keep in mind that if you're having insightful analysis, great, that's going to give you a really high grade. If it's a dialogue between, your sources that you're using, awesome. But if it's anything less than that, if it's just a summary of your sources, one point at a time, it doesn't really present original ideas, you could start to see a hit in your grade. And if you're wondering why your like research report didn't do too well, it's probably because of this, because you're not really making those connections that are needed for this type of research paper. So how to write a synthesis essay. First, consider your purpose in writing. What is it that you're trying to do? What is it are you asked to do, right? What is it you're trying to accomplish? In this second assignment, like I said, it's just a report. I just want to know what you found about your topic. But your second assignment will be an argument about your topic. Keep that in mind as you write it, right? Select and carefully read your sources according to your purpose. Always, this is what you should be working on now. You should be reading your sources carefully. You should be making notes. You should be highlighting information. You should be identifying aspects of your sources that you think are going to be really good to use for your paper. Eventually, you won't really do this until your third assignment, but you will formulate a thesis, basically your argument, right? What is it that you want to present based on what your sources have said? Of course, After that, you decide and how you'll use your source materials and then take notes. Always remember to keep highlighting stuff. It doesn't have to physically be highlighted, of course. You could use whatever PDFs and just highlight information that way. But always reread your sources. They're vital in explaining and setting up whatever credibility you want to have, especially with whatever argument you're going to make. Develop an organizational plan. We'll be doing this later on, but basically make a outline of your paper, especially for a paper of this length and this size and this depth. Having a great outline is going to be an incredible resource for your thing. Think of it as an attack plan, right? How are you going to go about writing this paper? And then, of course, easy part, right? Write your first draft. Again, this is why we're doing all this stuff first. We're finding sources, we're reading them, and then we're synthesizing them. Because once you start to the writing process, it'll be a lot easier, especially once we make an outline. Document your sources. Use MLA or APA as appropriate. We're using APA in this class, but try to also quote, paraphrase, and summarize. As always, don't quote your sources unless you necessarily. There's really, honestly, only reasons you should always paraphrase and summarize. Quote only if it's incredibly necessary, like, and don't quote more than a sentence, if that. And then, of course, revise your synthesis and this stuff that we will use. We do in class as we've seen so far. One thing to note, of course, is that this is something that you will do whenever you're asked to do any research paper. And these are kind of the steps that I've taken in the past that really helped me a lot. And sometimes, and this seems like long things to do, but honestly, we're just taking longer to do each of these steps. But honestly, most of the time, it's a week of work to do the list. So in service to helping you um, work on this, let us go over and share my screen over here. Let's close Zoom here. All right, so after seeing this PowerPoint presentation, what the best thing to do is, of course, practice synthesis. And I've given you here some under other assignments, a synthesis practice. As long as you just complete this as to the best of your ability, you'll get points. I just want you to practice this as part of your as of trying to figure out how synthesis works. So based on your sources, you're going to use your own sources to do this. You will submit a practice assignment here in this section here. And to start that, you first are going to, let's go back, please. Click on this here, the synthesis worksheet. You'll download this as a Word file, complete it, then upload it to Canvas. No need to use Google Docs for this. Just do it on Word, and that's fine. So first, just some things to kind of answer here. You will, once you're ready, just delete this stuff here, and then put your own answer. Delete this here. Based on, of course, this PowerPoint, these two questions should be pretty fast. And then here is a great way of figuring out how to synthesize your sources together, how they make connections. So here's the synthesis matrix. Fill this out to the best of your ability. Insert your title of your paper here, and then basically give me the main ideas. Oh, I'm sorry, the title here, and then whatever this here, and then give me the basic theme, right, and how they connect to each other. Here, I've given you an example of how to do this, and you can go and please do this for all your sources. So you might have to make this a little bit bigger, add more cells to make this as big as because you'll probably have most of your sources, if not all of them already, which I think is what 10 for this class. And then try to make as many connections as possible between them. Now, you don't have to necessarily be on point about this, that, yeah, this is exactly what it is. You can always change this later. This is just practice, okay? Especially for when you're going to start to write your research paper. Analyzing conventions, basically, here is what are some key similarities between the sources that you found? Are there any significant differences or contradictions? What are some insights you emerge when you're considering your sources together? Basically, what are the connections you make? What are some differences that are between these sources? And what are the things that you figured out based on these connections or differences, right? And here's an example of how you do this. You don't have to do this for all of your sources. I understand that you have 10 and that'll be a lot, but try one or two for this part. Here's practice different types of synthesis. So one thing I'm going to go over is the different types of synthesis that we have. Let me go over here to this sheet, different types of synthesis using journal articles. So this is just like a reference sheet that I made for you guys. to help you kind of figure out the different type of synthesis that you're going to have throughout your paper. You don't, now I want to make this clear as it's loading up, you don't have to use every single different type of synthesis. There's 8 total. If you only use 2, fine. That's totally okay. This is taking a while. I'll just open it up in Word. But it's good to know the different types that you may run into. Let's just open up the Word file here. Okay, so here's the Word file. So here's the different types of synthesis that you may find. Similarity synthesis, they agree on the same topic. Here's an example of what that would look like. Scholars like Andrea Lunsford and Stephen North both emphasize the collaborative nature of writing tutorials in academic settings. They highlight how collaboration between tutors and students enhances the learning process while also addressing its complexities. See, that's it. Do you see how they combine both of these different sources in this sentence and say these two agree with one another, and this is what they say about each of it. And this is the type of synthesis that you're going to do. Contrast synthesis. Berlin focuses on the histories of large, prestigious diversities, while Jaeger and Murdoch examines local university history and contrast trends found in large institutions. Together, these perspectives provide a comprehensive view of institutional development. So the differences that you saw in your sources, there's a contrast. Evidence-based argument synthesis. The type incorporates evidence from multiple studies to support an argument. This is great for when you have a major claim to make. Say you're claiming plastic bottles need to be removed. And this source, this source, this source, and this source all agree on me. And that's a great way to support your argument. The example I have here is of all the ways you can get physical exercise, walking is one of the that people continue long-term American Heart Association. However, Prince, 2013, found the community leaders in Wisconsin often recommended group activities focused on short-term weight loss. Thus, community leaders should prioritize walking programs for long-term benefits rather than short-term outcomes. The idea being that all these two sources support the idea of walking or doing short exercises. Thematic synthesis, here sources are grouped around a common theme or question. So the example is when exploring the impact of digital tools on education, several studies revealed complementary findings. Kerr and Fries discuss how digital reading tools engage college students in course materials. Another study emphasized the role of interactive platforms in enhancing comprehension and retention rates among students. By synthesizing these findings, one can argue that digital tools are instrumental of improving student engagement and learning outcomes. These two had different digital tools, but they both agreed digital tools was the way to go for this example. And that's exactly what you want to do. So maybe, like I said, maybe I'm doing the plastic bottles thing again. One of them says, you know what, we got to rid of single-use plastic because it's hurting the oceans. And the other one says we got to get rid of um, cheap plastic. I don't know, something like that, because it's hurting the sources. And they're talking about different plastics, but they end up in the ocean. It still supports my point. I'm still synthesizing them together. That's what you want to do. Integrative synthesis. This method combines quantitative and qualitative data to provide a holistic view. A systemic review might integrate findings from quantitative studies on the effectiveness of mindfulness interventions with qualitative research exploring participants' life experience. This approach not only evaluates measurable outcomes, but also contextualizes them from within personal narratives. I wouldn't worry about integrative synthesis. You really have to understand how data is used. Um, you will do this if you end up being more in the sciences where you use quantitative data, where it's like actual numbers and how those numbers support the argument that you're trying to make. But don't worry so much about it if you're not quite understand this. That's okay. There's definitely a variety of different synthesis you can use. Critical interpretive synthesis, these type of critiques and this type of critiques and reinterprets existing data to offer new insights. A critical interpretive synthesis might analyze studies on workplace diversity to argue that current metrics for measuring inclusions are insufficient. By comparing quantitative benchmarks with quantitative accounts of employee experiences, it can propose a more nuanced framework for assessing diversity. The idea being that you're critical of what you're seeing in your sources. So maybe there's something in plastic bottles and there's a critique on how they're made or maybe how they're a single use, and the data is saying that this is not the way to go. Again, something that you may not, these ones are two that you may not use as much, but that's okay. Again, this is a different type of synthesis and something that you would, again, use in the hard sciences. Meta-analysis, this involves statistically combining results from multiple quantitative studies. Again, these ones are like using like hard data. So basically the efficiency or efficacy of a drug and how it's used based on the numbers of how many people they've gotten is the example here. And then realist or meta-narrative data, basically the methods to explore contextual influence outcomes. So what are the outcomes of this study that was done? A realistic synthesis could examine how different healthcare systems implement telemedicine during crises like COVID-19. It would identify contextual factors that affect success rate across the region. So honestly, the best ones to use for you guys, these are ones good to mention, but the ones that I would focus on the most are these first four. Similarity, contrast, evidence-based, and then thematic. What is the theme between them all? These are more have to deal with harder data, but it's good to know them in case you will run into them in the future. But for our purposes, these first four are fine. These are great if you actually find your own data set and then compare it to somebody else. So imagine you went out there and start searching for bottles in the ocean yourself, and then you mark that, and then you made a graph, and then you made some statistics about it, and then you would use this kind of synthesis to show that, compare your data to other people's data. Great, but we're not really doing that. But it's good to know that this is a different type of synthesis. But anyways, like I said, this worksheet this sheet is just there to give you a rundown of each of these, so that can help you go back to our module here so that you can just go through some of these. So here, just practice. Did you find a similarity synthesis between two sources? Great. Write an example here of how you would write that draft. And I give you an example for each of these as well. See here. It's actually the same example as what you had before in the other sheet, but I included it here. And you would do the same thing. And again, you don't necessarily need to fill each and every single one of these. I don't imagine you guys will have integrative to realistic metadata. If you do, great. If you don't worry about it. But these first four, that's what you really want to focus on. How they're similar, how they're different, how they are thematically the same, and how they both use the same evidence to support your point. That's great synthesis. After that section, you then have drafting a synthesis paragraph. What are some topic sentences, the evidence source, connections, your analysis? And here's an example that I made for you. Of course, like I said, when you're ready to start, just delete all this and have your actual, just delete this section here, and then just have your paragraph here. And then a reflection is part 5. This is the last part. Just review your paragraph that you wrote. Does it include evidence from multiple sources? So based on what you wrote here, doesn't it clearly show connections between the sources? Is your own voice present in the analysis? Very important. Is this showing that you wrote this section? And revise and strengthen it if you need to. And this is just a quick like, yes, I did this, and this is how I did it. And that's kind of what I want to see. And this is a good start of how to synthesize some of your sources together to kind of be ready for your project 3, right? When we start doing, and these are just some tips here, transitions like similarity and contrast or complements to show relations between ideas. Avoid summarizing each source separately. That's a key thing that you want to keep in mind. A lot of early writers of using synthesis usually end up just summarizing the source instead of actually integrating ideas. Take this example, how it doesn't summarize the source, it just integrates the ideas from that source to support whatever point it's making. Cite all sources properly to, of course, to avoid plagiarism. And you see how this is cited all in 8PA, and you will be doing the exact same thing. Lee 2021, Smith 2020. So this is, again, just for practice. I just want you to do this and don't worry so much about doing it correctly or not. It's all about practicing synthesis, because this is what we're going to be doing in project 3 is combining the ideas of what we read from all of our different sources to come up with our major points. So that is it for synthesis and what you have to do for this assignment here. Once you see this PowerPoint, this presentation, please go ahead and start this assignment. And then, of course, you have your readings, which, like before from last week, go through multiple chapters and multiple sections. So that's it for this week. Just continue to read your sources, synthesize your sources, and then start to write your proposal, because that'll be due at the end of this week for peer review next week. All right. Thank you for joining me on this one. I will see you on the next video. Goodbye.